And so we are in our third and Hashem final class in this series on the question of heart transplants. Let's bring us up to where we are, so we know where we're going. So we really in the last two classes framed the essential issues. We could break it down like this. The first issue was the moment of death. That was the first issue. What is the moment of death? This is important because the only way for a heart transplant to be successful is if the donor still has a beating heart. If he still has a beating heart, and beating heart equals alive, then a heart transplant is murder of the donor. That's question one. What is the moment of death? So we determined from at least the sources in the Gemara, right? The sources in the Gemara about Yom Kippur, on Shabbos, the Gemara in Nuanced, I'm thinking Yom Kippur, but on Shabbos about taking off the rubble from someone who's in danger and looking for a heartbeat, implying that heartbeat determines life. If that's the case, then a donor whose heart is still beating, taking out his heart to give it to someone else, constitutes murder. If that's the moment of death. If halachically speaking, the moment of death is when the heartbeat stops, right? As opposed to the clinical, well, not even breathing, because breathing is probably more related to the heart, which Rabbi Feinstein gets into whether the link between breathing and heartbeat. But the clinical or the medical definition of death is brain dead. So brain dead means a person could still theory be breathing even, and the heart's for sure still beating, but there's no brain function. And then they can take the heart out and give it to the next patient, which if by Torah definition, heartbeat equals alive, and that's murder. And that's murder. That was point one. Point B is, and this was another angle that might give allowance to a heart transplant, is if we find some way in which you're allowed to kill someone a few minutes early, because by Torah definition he's going to die anyway, called a treifa. Can you kill a treifa in order to save someone who's living? I think the best proof we had was a story of, what was it, Ulla, who was traveling with two bullies, lack of a better term. One murdered the other, and the murderer turns to Ulla, did I do well? Ulla, of course, is scared of being killed on the spot and says, yeah, you did great. In fact, you should slaughter him a little bit more so he dies quicker. So here Ulla just killed someone who's going to die anyway, or at least was involved in pushing someone closer to death to save his own life. If that's the case. Can I push the donor's death a few minutes early in order to give this guy many more years? That was the two sides of the coin were, do I understand that murder is inherently bad and it doesn't make a difference what the consequences are? Murder is murder, period. Right? We have the story where the city is being surrounded and they're asking for one person. A group of people, right? So if they said, give us that guy, right? Versus saying, give us one other, they're being attacked and they're told, give us one guy for us to kill or we're killing all of you. We say, don't give it up. Why? If the issue is what's the value of one life versus another, that's the Gemara's language. Who told you your blood is whose blood is sweeter than the others? But in this case, there's clear whose blood is sweeter. There's one person's blood and here's 100 people's blood, including that guy. And yet we still say don't give it up, because murder is evil, period, irrespective of what the consequences are. We don't kill. That's the case. And just because he happens to be close to death, we still don't kill because the act is immoral, period. Or do I argue and say, no, ordinarily speaking, we aren't the arbiters of the value of life. But when Torah says this person's going to die anyway, maybe we could save him, use that guy's heart to save someone else. That was the other side of the coin. And the majority seems to be on the side of murder is murder is murder. And that's the end of it. What's left for us to determine is two more things, which is, number one is the recipient. If the lack of heartbeat constitutes death, and in order to give the recipient a new heart, I have to remove his old heart. So did the doctor, in removing the old guy's heart, the recipient's heart, did he murder him? So even though he's going to revive him later, but did he murder him? And is that allowed? And if murder is murder is murder, you can't do that. So never mind the donor, the recipient. And the practical ramifications is two things. Number one, we're going to learn soon that Rabbi Waldenberg writes that we are not responsible for the moral definition of death for a non-Jew. And thus, if doctors determine that the moment of death is brain dead, and that's their choice to do that, then I can take the heart of a non-Jew because they've elected to decide that that was the moment of death, even though I can't be a donor. So, but however, taking my heart, or sorry, taking a patient's heart out in order to put the new heart in is considered murder, then you can't take anybody's heart. And case number 2 is the case with the heart, with the pig's heart, right? Where in the case where I'm taking the heart from the pig, this most recent transplant, where you take the pig, there's no issue of killing the pig, so kill the pig, big deal. So you kill the pig to save a life. Good, no problem. But the recipient, is he allowed to take that heart, considering that if take out his current heart, and that might constitute murder? That's question 1 we're going to have to deal with. And the other thing we're going to deal with is there is at least this suggestion. It's a minority opinion, and Rabbi Feinstein seems to be the minority. We're going to get into that brain dead does equal death. In which case, you can just do straight heart plants. There's no problem at all. But again, this is a very controversial position, as we're going to learn, and he's in the minority, as we're going to learn as well. So those are the issues we're going to deal with. Did I cover everything? I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, I think that's all. So let's get into it. It's a lot of pages here, but it's not as much as it looks.
Yeah. How long does a guy like time when the recipient normally just think this hard, checks hard? It's a long time.
I don't know how long it is. I don't know.
How do they keep him alive? What happens?
I don't know how. I don't know.
When they take in the recipient's heart, how long does it take the heart?
No, so the first thing the first thing they do is a pump.
So then he's
First they pump, then they take the heart out, and then they put a new heart out, and they take the pump off.
So then he's
Did I get that right?
But the heart,
okay. So if Torah says the presence of a heart is life and the lack of a heart is death, it makes a difference if the functions of the heart are being held by a machine, you still kill. Okay, so you're right, and we're going to learn from Rabbi Auerbach that makes that argument, which is why it's permissible. But I'm just giving you both sides of the coin. So let's see. So the first text we will have here is the Chacham Tzvi. We learned the Chacham Tzvi once. We discussed him once when we were learning about the guy who had the option to come out of jail for one day, and which day should he choose? That was the Chacham Tzvi. That was the Chacham Tzvi. We had 2 choices, Rivash and the Chacham Tzvi on that one. Okay, so the Chacham Tzvi is now writes like this. This is a fascinating story. I'll read it in English because the translation has been made available online. The translation does not have the entirety of the back and forth of the halachic analysis, but it has the main point, which is good for our purposes. So he reads like this. Following occurred. A young girl had opened the stomach of a properly slaughtered chicken in order to clean it out on the edge of a table. Right? A cat stood right below the table, anticipating that might eat whatever would fall to the ground. Okay, phrasing is a little interesting. Anyway, the cat's waiting for some chicken. Afterwards, the girl claimed that she did not find the chicken's heart. The mother of the girl said it was possible, in fact, almost certain, that the heart had been accidentally thrown to the ground and eaten by the cat, which was excited to eat whatever came close to it. The girl insisted that she did not give the heart to the cat. The chicken was fat, healthy, and good. There was nothing abnormal, nor was anything torn in its innards. There was no indication that its heart had shrunk or melted. Nothing at all was abnormal in all its innards. While it had been alive, it was strong, healthy, and had a normal koyach, strength. This is it's from Safari, which is like crowdsourcing translation. So it depends on who decided to write the translation that's there. It's not authoritative. Okay, so it had normal strength, eating and drinking, walking and flying, and had all its normal function. Was at full strength. In short, it was as healthy as all other healthy chickens. However, the girl insisted that she did not find the heart. So of course, what's the problem? The problem is a chicken without a heart is a treifa, right? This is the whole law of treifa is if an animal suffers from a condition that Torah determines this chicken won't survive for 12 months. There's a whole list of stuff. One of them is lack of heart, right? So this would make the chicken invalid the kitchen. Invalid
But it can't be, it has no heart, it can't live if there's no heart.
So it says, answer. All those who claim that the chicken was treif are in error. For it is clear to all whose hearts are wise and whose brains are sharp, that it is impossible for any animal in the world to live for even a moment without a heart, as if they were healthy. One cannot imagine such a situation. Rather, as soon as the heart is cut out of a creature, they have been slaughtered. Those are the key words. And what about the possibility that there has been a sickness? It is impossible to say that the heart had shrunk or melted without the creature having been incredibly sickly. And yet this chicken wasn't sickly or ill. On the contrary, it was fat, healthy, good, and normally functioning. The matter is clear that the heart fell out of the opening in the stomach and that the cat ate it. This is indeed so obvious that it does not require proof. However, to silence the mouths of those idiots who are so eager to
Oh.
again, this translation. Let's find the Hebrew. I'll tell you what he says.
Is this someone's on Iron Man?
No. This is Rabbi. This is the Chachotzi.
Who's writing this?
He writes tipshim. The ain't tzarich raya listim. The ain't tzarich raya listim pi hatipshim. Idiots. Yeah, it's accurate. Tipish is an idiot. Okay, however, to silence the mouths of the idiots who are eager to rule in this case, I cite the ruling of Kesefish to the law of slaughtering, who gives a reason why Maimonides is not missing a heart or born without a heart, limbs which were to be removed, limbs which, were they to be removed, the animal could not live for a moment. Maimonides did not list them. So we say like this: there are things called evarim shaneshama tluy behem, limbs that the life of the animal is dependent on. And Rambam lists a list of these limbs, and to say if you're missing those, then the animal's a treifa. He doesn't include heart. So the Kesef Mishnah writes that the reason is because it cannot live without a heart at all. So you're never going to find a dead animal without a heart. You'll find a dead animal without a spleen, let's say, or without a liver, and it's surviving temporarily. And it's on the list, and say it's considered a treifa, but heart's not in the list because it won't make you without a heart. So this doesn't exist, and therefore there must have been a heart in it. What are we deriving from here? So this ends the translation, but the text keeps on going with sources that heart equals life. So there are those who wanted to argue from this that taking the heart out, even to put a new heart in, constitutes murder.
When would you find a chicken without like just the thing you said, right?
I don't know. I just pulled out of my hat. Let's pull it up. Let's pull it up. Mishnah law, Kesef Mishnah laws of slaughter 10. So pull it up. Give me a second. We'll pull it up. It's other. There are other parts of the animal that it might be missing or defected, but it can survive temporarily. It'll survive temporarily, and then it's still considered. It's still considered a treifa because it won't survive, right? So let's do laws of slaughter.
Does someone holds like what's this girl saying?
It seems like there were those at the time who were like,
Tell me who can hold like
I don't know.
She's
She's asking a question. She has no opinion.
Is that what you're saying?
She's a poor girl asking a question. Okay, where would it? No, it's safer ritual slaughter. Number 10, we said it was, right? So let's see.
Her problem is that she thinks it's a trade chicken. Have a heart.
It's just the fact that the chicken can live without.
Okay.
She's convinced the chicken had no heart.
I didn't do anything wrong, she said. I didn't do wrong.
She's not fully trade.
Sorry?
They're bringing the story down.
Right. No, didn't have the heart.
Yeah. Okay, I have to find the Kesef Mishnah to take some time. Let's see if we can work with this.
There we go. Get the heart, let's change it over.
Get your friend Scott.
Let's see. Maybe it's here. Hold on a second.
Oh my God.
Let's see. 1 second. Hold on a second. I might be pulling it up here. He gives a bunch of things.
One spleen is one of them.
No, it's like the lung is punctured or this or that. No, but it's talking about missing limbs. Okay, my apologies. I didn't look this up before. Oh, hey, yes, chaser keres. If he's missing a where is it? Missing part of the cheek, missing part of the liver, missing part of the certain types of ligaments, right? Missing parts of the lung, things like that. Missing part of the stomach, certain parts of the stomach, things like that. Okay, so take a long look. Okay, let's just, the bottom line is like this. Okay. So there are some that wanted to use this to argue. There are some that wanted to argue that because of this, because a heart is by halacha determined as something that must be there for the living. So if this person, the recipient, has the heart removed, it's considered murder, and therefore you can't do it. Now, I looked in quite a few places in terms of like articles that collect a lot of these sources, and I haven't found anyone that gives like an actual counter argument to what's said here. Rabbi Feinstein actually does a little bit give a counter, but not exactly, but sort of give a counter argument. But I haven't found someone that gives a counter argument outright. But we do see all over that it's permitted to be the recipient of a heart transplant. That we see clearly, and we're going to list a couple of sources for that.
In other words, the recipient is kosher, but the donor maybe not.
That's right.
So then how does you can't have one without the other?
So,
have to take You gotta take.
I don't see the case of Mishnah that is referring to.
Well, take off.
Let's look about time. Okay, so again, so the practical ramification would be A, if a non-Jew does it, and we're not responsible to tell them that that constitutes alive or not. If they give that definition for death, that's okay. That's what Eliezer writes. And number two is the case of the pig's heart. Can you be the recipient of the pig heart? And based on the fact that this logic has been rejected, even though we're all going to agree that the chicken definitely had a heart, we'll all agree with the chachatzi there. But to then say that therefore a human without a heart is considered murder, even though you've got machines pumping the thing, that we don't have to go so far. So a little bit, we're going to see a response to this in the next text, which is from Nishmas Avraham. The Nishmas Avraham, as you can see, it's written by Rabbi Avraham Sofer, but the Nishmas Avraham is kind of like it's a halachic encyclopedia of medical ethics. In some ways, it's got everything in there. It's like the go-to source for collecting information on medical ethics, and very, very strongly heavily influenced by leading modern authorities of today, most notably Rabbi Auerbach and Rabbi Eliashiv and Rabbi Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Waldenberg. He was in constant communication with all of these major leading figures and wrote his book accordingly. Now, I don't know when this book was written, but you're going to see from the description that it's not necessarily a perfectly modern book, but somewhat prophetic, as we'll see.
We have an expert here in Montreal who lectures different places around the world.
Rabbi Weiss.
Rabbi Weiss,
Yeah, he's a world expert on medical ethics in Torah, yes.
On what?
Medical ethics in Torah by Weiss here, our local Dayan. He's our local Dayan,
Right.
our local Av Bezdin. Okay, so this comes from the Nishmas Avraham, writes like this. He's discussing the issue of hashtolas lev malchuti with an aleph, meaning a mechanical heart. This is like an artificial heart, artificial heart transplant. He's not talking about human heart transplant. He's talking about artificial heart transplant. But this is, for our purposes, is important because we're talking about the recipient. And the recipient's end, the question of the recipient taking out his heart to be replaced by something else doesn't make a difference what's coming in there. So the answer comes the same.
Mechanical heart.
Right. Yeah. Is that a thing that exists today? Not that I know of. But he writes like this.
But these machines can be like
Function,
a
yes.
mechanical heart.
Yeah,
They
so,
used to do it.
yeah.
Mechanical heart?
Pacemaker is not a mechanical heart.
No.
That's a regulator. It's a regulator. Yeah, no, that's not a mechanical heart. Okay, let's go through because I want to cover all the pages. I don't want to be stuck here next week again. Okay, so Matzav Hayoim, at the current state, writes the Nishmas Avraham, it's still in the testing phases. Mistaber, it would make sense that because it's still in the testing phase, it would be forbidden for a sick person, for a patient, to agree for such an operation, to put a mechanical heart to replace his. It would be forbidden for a doctor to implement such an operation, considering that it's in the testing phases. So you don't know the success. He already establishes earlier in his book that that halachic ruling does go based on consideration of like what are the percentages of survival and how long will he live afterwards with after the operation, post-op versus pre-op, and so on. Meaning a person's healthy now, but he may predicted to die in X amount of months. But if he gets this operation, there's a chance he won't survive, but there's a greater chance of living for longer. These kinds of considerations he discusses. Now, in the case where it's still experimental, certainly not forbidden, not permissible to volunteer to be a subject for such a test. However, the Merutzas Hayom Hashem, as time will go on, God willing, Merutzas Hayom means like he's like hoping it will happen quickly. And the medical knowledge, Yiskadim, will advance Achiyu Sikuyim, till there will be solutions, Toivim, good solutions, Brurim, and clear solutions, for the success of such operations. He's like hoping for a mechanical heart to be invented one day. And in this way to lengthen the life of the patient. It's quite possible. It would be permissible for someone who's a patient whose days are numbered and to do such an operation. And this would be equal to kol nituach, like every other operation, lepatuach, open heart surgery. Every open heart surgery has a huge risk of the operating table being the end, and yet we still permit it, considering that we have a very high rate of success and there's a major possibility that the person's going to lengthen his life by X amount of years. So we permit it. So when the time comes, says the Nishma Savram, that mechanical hearts will be successful, then I would imagine it's going to be permissible, he writes.
That's not the issue.
What's so which means that means he's imagining a situation where we have a mechanical heart, we'll take out the patient's heart and put a mechanical heart in, which means he's saying the removal of a heart doesn't constitute murder. Right? So we're going to apply that logic to the recipient of the pig heart or the.
As long as
But
there's something.
but he's not giving a reason.
Okay, so let's see.
He didn't give a reason.
That's what I'm saying.
He's just saying a fact.
That's what I'm saying. So I haven't found a little bit, we'll see, but I haven't found really huge, strong, like halachic counter arguments to Chacham Tzvi, so much as we just find people just saying it's fine because people live, so it's okay, we're doing it. Without anybody saying, well, what about the sources you said that you have to have a heart to live? A little bit, we're going to see a little bit. Let's see. Let's see what he says. However, he's going to say right now, Ra'isi, I found in other sources, writes the Nishmas Avram. Again, he's a huge like encyclopedia, so he conglomerates from all over. So he has a lot of his own opinions, as you see here. He says what he thinks, but to a large degree, it's a collection from all over, which makes it a wonderful work, very thorough. However, Ra'isi, I've seen, says Nishmas Avram, I saw other sources, Shadonu B'zel Iser, that said it might be forbidden to do such an operation. Why? Because of murdering the patient, and the very fact that you're removing his heart from his body. That's our issue. But this requires further investigation and understanding. Every single open heart surgery today, indeed, we don't remove the heart from the guy's body when you do open heart surgery. But they completely silence the heart. They stop the heart completely. I ate trufas through various different medical procedures. And the function of the heart to pump the blood to the rest of the body is done by a machine, which is which is this artificial heart, which is standing outside the patient. What's that machine called? What's the machine called?
Pumps the heart.
So during all open heart surgery, they lower the heart rate to 0, flat line, and then they replace the function of the heart with a machine. It's outside the body. Well, boy, who kosher is connected to that machine. Now, these guys are suggesting that the removal of the heart would be a problem because that's considered murder. Why is that different than open heart surgery where you're stopping the function of the heart? I've never heard anybody say that open heart surgery is a problem because we're murdering the patient by making his heart flatline. So what's the difference if the heart technically is in the body, but it's flatlined versus the heart out of the body? We doctors nowadays completely end the function of the heart when we do open heart surgery. And yet, writes Nishmas Avram, I haven't found anybody credible say you're not allowed to do that because you're murdering the patient. So why would it be different for taking out the heart? Same thing. Yeah. Now he adds.
The procedure that you're describing is a heart
Sorry?
stop, as a heart stop or slowed down to such an extent that it appears to be flatline. Is that
No,
actually stopped?
Yes, they stop the heart completely. Completely stop the heart. The pumping of the blood happens through a machine outside, which I can't remember what it's called. And can't remember what it's called. And then they operate on the heart. And then they determine that the heart is capable of repumping the blood. They slowly switch the function of the machine to the heart, and then they turn the machine off. Right? That's how procedures are done.
Maybe it's different at your own heart, not removing and could be.
Okay, so
But in theory, this makes sense.
this is what he writes. But we're going to see other sources that also say, like, just of course you can take the heart.
There's a Gemara that talks about, are you able to, if it's a certainty that one is going to die,
Mhm.
can one do something that may shorten his life even more? Or if it comes out positive, and that's why he's going to do it, it'll extend it for many, many years.
This is our discussion.
That's what
So the
it
halacha, this is our discussion. That's right. So we quoted some of those Gemaras in the past, but this is the discussion. So over there, you're talking about his own life. Over here, it's somebody else's life. Can I end his life a few minutes early to save someone else's life? Right?
Well, it could be basically the same Gemara.
Somewhat, yeah. Yeah. Okay, let's see further. So he writes, the Mishnah Sofram continues. In addition to this fact that open heart surgery is an accepted practice amongst all leading everybody, even though we stop the heart. So there's no reason to make that any different than taking the heart out. Effectively, it's the same. You're rendering the body physically heartless, right? But additionally, Halakas of Maran, the Shulchan Aruch writes, when listing the treifa, right? We said that Rambam doesn't list missing heart, but the Shulchan Aruch does. He writes, Nitel halev, if the heart is missing, bein biyad, whether we took it by hand, bein machmas choli treifa, whether the heart is taken because of a sickness that causes him to be a treifa, meaning to be someone who's about to die. End quote. Ad kan. Now, so put that. Stack on top of that the Rambam, which writes, Shekoyse l'gabei treifa, v'joymer arofim shemakazu in lo tala ba'adam u'ba'yamas. The treifa, definitionally, by Rambam is someone about whom the doctor says he will not live. Now apply that to the statement we just made before. The statement we made before was that what's considered someone who's missing a heart, either by hand it's taken, or it's because it's a sickness that's going to make him a treifa, right? But if we know he's going to survive, does that make him a treifa? No, because the definition of treifa is, by Rambam's definition, when the doctors say he will die. But in the case of flatlining his heart during open heart surgery, the doctors are not going to say he's going to die. They're actually going to say he's going to live, which means he's not a treifa, right? Additionally, the Chazon Ish writes, nowadays, harbe treifas, even people who are halachically considered treifas, we can heal them. And indeed, this is the reality. We have people who 50 years ago are considered people who are effectively waiting to die, and today they're not. All kinds of illnesses. So putting all that together, so royim, we see, if the guy's going to live, achakach, if the person's going to live afterwards, it becomes clear that he was always living. And he never had the qualification of someone who's been dead, which means like this. The only reason to use the Chacham Tzvi as a reason to say that removing of the heart is dead is if he remains dead after the removal of the heart. But if he continues living, there's no such thing, says the Nishmas of Avraham, as someone who is alive now, was dead, but was alive before. The only question is, there's a point at which we're not sure if he's alive or dead. If he dies, then we know he died. But if he lives, we know he was alive then too. It's a question of clarifying later what was the status. So considering that after the heart's inserted, or after the operation is closed up, he continues to live, that means he was always alive, even at the time of the operation. Right? And specifically Khan, and here he adds to your point, Justin, Shetafkid Halev, the function of the heart, which is to pump the blood throughout the body, is being done by a machine. So even if he doesn't have a fleshly heart, he has the functionality of a heart. So what are you so hung up on the fact that he doesn't have a technical heart? The functionality of the heart is working. Plus we see he continues to survive. So why would you call this murder? Baruch Hashem, thank God I found the source for this. The Hiskimiti Agoin of Shem Shlomo Zalman Auerbach Zatzal, and Rabbi Auerbach agreed with me. So I'm very happy, even though it's funny, he's making predictions about the future. But he turned out to be right. That we can remove someone's heart and he continues to live. Buy a new heart, to buy a machine. Maybe one day we'll have machines. We've gone from human hearts now to pig hearts. Maybe one day by a machine. So it's not unlikely, it's not unreasonable. And he makes a very cogent argument, even though he doesn't make a halachic argument countering the Chacham Tzvi, but he makes a very sound argument as to why it's not considered death. And using halacha, and that if the person continues to live, then obviously he was living always. So if he lives after the heart's removed and replaced, then he was alive even at the time when it was out, considering the fact that the functionality of the heart never stopped, even if he technically didn't have a heart. Yeah. So this is one way of thinking about it very clearly. Another source is, this is what I was mentioning yesterday. Last week I mentioned that Rabbi Kanievsky addresses the question of the recipient of a heart transplant. That's what I said last week. It's a mistake. I meant Rabbi Eliashiv, not Rabbi Kanievsky. And this is a big problem when you're quoting people who quote people who quote people. Because when I actually went to the source, he's discussing something else entirely. But nonetheless, it's relevant. Because there's a number of different articles and things that were pointing to a source from Rabbi Eliashiv saying that a recipient may receive the heart. And it's true, Rabbi Eliashiv did say the recipient may receive the heart, but that's not the object of the tshuva. It's like it happens often, both in the secular world and in the Torah world also, unfortunately, when sources quote sources that are quoting sources and you forget to look up the original, and you take the inference of the guy who quoted him as if that's what the original guy said. It's not necessarily the case. Yeah, a little bit. Okay, so what did Rabbi Lashiv actually discuss?
It also happens very often in comments. It says,
No, no.
Said in the name of.
Yeah, but that's not misquoting.
No, I know, but it's like 10 people quoting.
Yeah, that's tradition. I'm saying here it's when,
Right.
people like in
No, I don't mean to suggest
Anyway,
that the Talmud is.
no, the Talmud itself is a primary source.
Right.
Right. This is when you have the source in front of you, but instead of looking it up, you just quote someone who quoted it.
Okay.
There's
That's-
nothing wrong with the fix with Jewish people with the fix.
I don't see the
That can
problem.
be the normal thing now. They can use animals.
well, for years, the valves have been used by pigs all the time. Right, you can get from
Or
sheep, right? You
something
can get,
else. Yeah,
I don't see it's a problem. I remember I was once in, when I was in my notes. I don't know if you're still doing this when you were there. Was there Rabbi Fink?
Yeah.
Yeah. Rabbi Fink is
Genius.
maybe the smartest man I've ever met. I don't know, but he's unbelievably genius fellow. And a very simple person in some ways.
Yeah.
Anyway, so you come give a class once a week and you give a paired class, but you always begin by saying, does anybody have any questions of a pressing nature? The question will come up and you basically never get to his class. But he on the spot, quote sources, things, unbelievable. Knows languages, and it's kind of like different kind of level of genius. Anyway, so he was once asked about cloning. And he wanted to know what Torah would say about cloning. This is 10 years ago, so the technology wasn't as advanced as it is today, but it still was something that was people talked about. And he said, the discussions are still ongoing, obviously, but if history is any indicator, whenever there's something that actually at the end of the day ends up saving lives, one way or another, Torah will find a way to say that's what we should do. Right? No, saving lives always comes out winning. Always comes out winning on the end, even if you find, right. So the same thing is kind of true with like the being a recipient of, let's say, a pig heart. You might find a source here, that, and the other. At the end, the sources that point to the fact that this is saving a life are going to outwin. This is how Torah ends up. This is what he said. So it's an interesting point. Anyway, okay. So what does Rabbi Elyashiv discuss? So let's look at page 5 at the top. So I only quote the beginning and the end because the whole middle part is not relevant. The whole middle part is a discussion about something else. He writes like this: Al derech hashayla, with respect to the question, is it permissible for a sick person, patient, lakabel, to receive hashtalas lev, a heart transplant, hoya v'yadezeh, because through this shemaskim, he agrees lakabel, to receive the heart, who goydim lakatzl yomov shal hatorim, he is essentially being the cause of causing the donor to shorten his life. So am I allowed to be on the receiving end?
He's going anyway. The donor is dying anyway.
It doesn't matter if I'm the cause of ending his
He
life.
doesn't even know.
We're going to learn soon from Rabbi.
Now they just take them because they need like a whole thing. Not even,
Right.
you know what I mean? They just someone that's about to die, they take cards.
They have to have a donor card.
No, I mean, if someone that is
Right.
willing to donate there.
Right. So the question is, am I allowed to be the cause of making his life shorten? Now, it's not 1,000% clear to me, but it's pretty clear to me that the scenario that Rabbi Elyashiv is dealing with is the question of you don't know who the donor is. Now, you don't know if he's Jewish or not Jewish. Right? Now the question becomes a question of majority and minority. Maybe it's a Jewish patient, maybe it's not. I'm quite certain that's what he was referring to. Otherwise, I don't understand what he's writing. It could literally be a full misreading on my part, and I'm going to look at it again now. But it seems pretty clear to me that that's what it is. And thank you, Rahel, for getting me a copy of it.
It also depends if it's the whole world that is going, but it could be one area, it could be a Jewish area.
Right. So the question is, do you follow majority in these kind of cases? The rules of following majority are not that simple. So I'm looking at it again.
Depends where the majority is from.
So yeah, he talks about majority of non-Jews or Jews. So this is where he says the kol ha'omer, based on all the above, after a whole discussion on the issue of majority and whether you rely on the majority, considering, let's say you're in Montreal where the majority of people are not Jewish, you can rely on the majority, in this particular case. So the most of his discussion is about the question of majority and minority and whether you rely on majority in cases of medical ethics, right? But what you do derive from here, and this is what it seems people are quoting him for, even though it's not his main discussion, is that he accepts, as a matter of fact, you may receive. The question is only if in doing so you're causing the other person to shorten his life. But he never raises the issue of the patient's death itself, and that his heart's being removed. Meaning he starts on the premise that the patient is not considered dead by having his heart replaced. It's just a question of shortening the life of the donor. And can you rely on majorities and minorities in that? Can you rely on majorities in that case? Following? That's what's inferred from what he writes here. Understand? So I just want to clarify that it doesn't really teach us much, but just it gives us another leg to stand on. That yeah, you can take a heart transplant, no problem. Being a donor is a different story, but you can take a heart transplant, and you can rely on.
You could.
That's right. So I don't know who the donor is. Maybe it's a Jewish donor. So he goes through a whole back and forth about whether or not you can rely on the principle of majority. There's all kinds of principles called the parish. Whenever it's kavua, it's mechzel, it's lo pashut at all. About when you can and cannot rely on majorities. And he rules, based on the whole back and forth that he explains, you can rely on the majority here, right? So we can infer from this that he's okay being a recipient in terms of the recipient's heart going out temporarily. That he doesn't even raise as an issue. Which means he accepts it as that being okay.
That's why.
I understand, but the point
that's very important.
I'm just making, yes, it is. I'm just making the point because we were discussing now if the patient is it considered a murder of the patient? That's what we've been discussing. The Chacham Tzvi says if you're lacking a heart, you're dead. So maybe you can't take out the heart from the patient, right? So we learned from the Nishmas Avram that it's fine, and now we're seeing from Rabbi Eliashiv it's also fine. That's the point. That the recipient's end is not considered murder of the recipient just because we're temporarily taking his heart out. Okay. Now before we get to, let's skip page 5, 6, 7. That's the question of Rabbi Feinstein. We'll get to that in a second. Let's go to page 9.
The reason I'm going is because they hold brain death. Nothing to do with that.
That's right.
Because you can't kill anyone if it's the heart that's killing.
That's right. The modern science does heart transplants because they have determined that the moment of death is brain dead. And therefore the person could be breathing even, and the person can have a heart pumping, but he's dead because he's brain dead. Yeah. Okay, now let's go to Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, which is the Mincha Shlomo, the famous Rabbi Auerbach. Sorry? They're almost all these, they're all, actually not almost, except for the Chacham Tzvi, everybody's been contemporary. The people we're talking about heart transplants, how long ago heart transplants been invented, right? So it's not that long ago. Page 9. So there you go. So everybody we read is going to be contemporary. No, actually, unfortunately, everybody we quoted so far has passed. Rabbi Gershoni even himself, they all passed within the last 30, 40 years. Meaning contemporary. Yeah. Okay, so let's see Rabbi Auerbach. He writes beautifully. Now, page 9. Now, Rabbi Auerbach actually is a source that I saw that counters the Gemara, explains the Gemara, right? Because we had the Gemara, the strong foundation to permit heart transplant, even when it's a Jewish donor, is based on this notion that you might be allowed to kill someone who's a treifa, who's about to die, kill him a few minutes early in order to save someone else. Yeah. Right? And this is based on the fact that Ullah told that murderer, yeah, kill him more. He did so to save his own life, right? Yeah. So how do you remember that Gemara? Yeah, I know, but so how do we explain that Gemara? We haven't yet had someone to counter that, and Rabbi Auerbach will address that now. So says Rabbi Auerbach, this is the question that's posed to him. A patient that is waiting for a transplant. He cannot position himself to be the receiving end of a transplant in Israel. Getting at this issue of majority. So if he put himself on the list in New York, not a problem, because in that case, as Rabbi Eliashiv says, because the majority is not Jewish, you don't have to worry about the fact that maybe it's a Jew. That's what Rabbi Eliashiv ruled. The recipient, the donor, which means you're the cause of the donor's shortened life. We don't know who he is.
You don't know.
Not necessarily. Yeah, let's say you don't. Okay, but he said in Israel, you certainly can't put yourself on the list. Why? Because by putting himself online to be receiving, to be the recipient of a heart in Israel, he's causing the shortening of the life of the donor, in which case the majority would be Jewish.
So it's the opposite of the other way.
That's right. That's right. It's not a contradiction, it's just different scenarios. Now, now to your point, who someone may have said this point, the af in gabel adavium mu'ademachedim sheyavru akach, even though with him not being online, someone else will take the heart, which means the person's moment of death will be the same. And the doctor will do the same murder, whether I'm online or not. Someone else will get the heart, right? Unless usher, you are forbidden. Because here in Israel, the majority are Jewish people, and therefore, even if the person is going to die anyway at the hands of someone else, you can't be the one to do it. This gets back to what we talked about last week. Murder is murder is murder. Justifications are out the window. So don't tell me I'm allowed to murder because if I don't murder, someone else is going to do the murder. It doesn't work that way. So even if this person's heart is going to be cut out anyway and be given to someone else, you are not to be on the line. Murder is murder, forbidden is forbidden. Yeah. Bypass. Thank you. Oh my gosh, how did I not remember that word? Bypass. Thank you. Okay. Now so this is his ruling. You cannot put yourself on the line in Israel where there's Jewish donors, because you are effectively, even if you're not doing the murder directly, but you are the cause of the murder. You're the cause of this patient to die a few minutes early, contributing to the murder. Now, that's what I'm saying. Much it does. He might have been Eretz Yisrael, but he's writing to a Rav named Rav Shaga Feivel Cohen, and Rabbi Cohen clearly describes the scenario very. The reason why I'm saying non-Jewish because the first source he quotes the Shulchan Aruch, which talks about a child that's found outside of a city, whether it's the majority, and he discusses if the majority of the city is Jewish or non-Jewish, and what you determine the status of this child is, and whether you can save this person's life or not. Well, is it Jewish or not Jewish, based on the majority or minority? And then goes into the whole discussion about whether you can or cannot rely on a minority or majority in cases of pikuach nefesh, and concludes, as we read, you may, which is why I'm concluding he's discussing the issue of a non-Jewish donor or non-Jewish city in which the majority is non-Jewish. That's why I'm concluding that. Again, so I want to separate between what I'm quoting versus my inference. This is my inference. Okay. Now,
what's the difference? Is a Jew or Goya? When you say you can't kill anyways, why they?
So again, Rabbi, okay, so we can skip to if you want to see.
This whole thing is irrelevant.
Okay, so to address this issue, what's the difference between a Jew and a non-Jew? We didn't spend much time on the subject, but let's just do it here anyway. Go to the next page. Right after the next page. We'll come back to Rabbi Auerbach in a second. I hope we're bouncing around a little bit, but I hope we're getting some clarity. Okay, this is the Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Waldenberg, the next page. Right, there's no numbers there. Rabbi Waldenberg, who we had occasion to learn before on the question of cosmetic surgery.
And even before with the prison thing, he would say.
Tzitz Eliezer was something else we did. Oh, we did something else in the Tzitz Eliezer, which was there was another question we learned before the cosmetic surgery, which was what?
That was the davening there with the president. He wasn't involved in that one.
No.
The one right before that.
There's another one we did. You're right. I don't remember.
Maybe the one that the girl was the boy with the girl.
I remember. Anyway, so he says like this. Let's see. Okay, look at the last paragraph on the left-hand side. As we're going to see, we won't be able to read the letter, but he writes a very strong letter that I'm shocked and appalled that the heart transplants are happening in Israel. Anyone who has the capability to stop it must stop it. It's outright murder. And he goes a whole list of scholars that agree with him. And this is basically the conglomerate of the majority opinion, which said that heart transplants are forbidden. Before you, that's your way of putting it. So murder, like Torah law, we don't do that, right? That's the point. Okay, that's why this question is so delicate, because it's either murder or it's life-saving, right? There's no middle ground. And if it's murder, then life-saving doesn't justify murder, right? Which is basically what the halachic argument here is by the Tzitz Eliezer and the majority opinion.
So who says Rabbi Wahlberg says that you're not allowed to use it in Israel?
Everybody says you can't. You can't be the donor. and you cannot perform it. But here's what the thing. Now, I will admit, Mama Super Akamakdolim, that which is told about many of the great leading halachic thinkers, that even after they forbade the heart transplant, they made it known their opinion to allow certain special circumstances that came before them after they ruled it's forbidden. So why would they permit it? Aval says Rabbi Waldberg, here's why they permit it. So there are scholars which you will read that make public announcements, it's forbidden, and then certain cases say, yes, but you're allowed to. Why? So he explains. Aval goal of do it's clear. It was when the donor and the doctor were not Jews. And therefore these scholars held or believe or of the opinion of the view that one can't permit this because for them, those non-Jews, it is indeed permissible. We are not responsible to forbade that which non-Jews permit.
Because they're only dead.
Because in other words, we are not, Halacha is not responsible to go to scientific offices and say, you guys are defining the moment of death wrong. We are responsible to say that Halachic observant Jews, this is what we follow. So if the non-Jewish scientific world comes to the conclusion that brain dead is brain dead, we don't have to change our minds. And therefore, if they are offering a heart to you to take it. But
you're not
so
brain dead.
that's right.
You're not killing.
It's a very delicate thing. It's a very delicate thing, which, some part of me says, you're right. Like, if you're not allowed to kill, then you're not killed. We're supposed to think if the donor's a Jew or not Jew. On the other hand, Real Waldenberg is saying,
But these are all the
sorry?
loopholes. That's why you get winning. That's how it is.
no, it's a question of what's our responsibility. It's not a question of loophole. It's a question of what's our responsibility. Is it Halacha's responsibility?
We're learning all of this rabbi from this. He comes from this angle. He comes from that angle.
Yeah.
Depends what you're doing.
The question is, what's
They
the,
found the way. That is like that.
so what's our responsibilities? What's our halachic responsibilities? Is it our halachic responsibility to bang down the doors of all medical offices and say, you guys got the moment of death wrong?
No.
And if the answer is not, then if a non-Jewish doctor is taking out a heart of a non-Jewish patient based on their agreed perception of what death is, I can't take it. So you can. But if it's a Jew, and I'm a Jew, the doctor's a Jew, and the patient's a Jew, and we're all obligated by halacha, I cannot stand there and say, well, you guys violate halacha, but I'll take it. That I can't do. That's the distinction he's making. Clear? So that solves that issue. Let's go back
What was
now.
the last one you said? The Svero, the Kibble, what?
Oh, they svaru, therefore they agreed.
Right.
The kiblu, they accepted upon themselves because to implement such a thing. Gam kashar nishtal, even when the recipient, who Yehudi, is a Jew, right?
Yeah.
Mashtal is the giver, and then nishtal is the taker, the recipient. Okay, so let's go back to page 9 and read by Auerbach. Very nice tshuva by Auerbach tshuva, and he addresses this Gemara, which was the strongest Gemara to argue that you may kill a person who's almost going to die. Go back one page, basically 2 pages. Rabbi Auerbach addresses this Gemara, which we quoted last week. We mentioned earlier, Ullah, who effectively encouraged this murderer to hasten the death of the guy who murdered, and he did so to save his own life, right? He's afraid this psychopath who just slaughtered someone is going to slaughter him next, right? The three of them are alone in the desert, or wherever they're traveling, and he's watching one guy murder another. And then the murderer says, hey, did I do well? What am I going to say? No, you're a bad guy? No, I'm also going to die if I say such a thing. So we're Jews, yes. And he told them, he told the murderer, not only did good, you should actually cut a little more, make it quicker. So we see that Ullah actually used the quickening of someone else's death to save his own life. Even, he's going to die anyway. He did. Now I made him die a little quicker in order to save my own life. So if that's the case, maybe someone who's about to die anyway, in a question of 5 minutes, maybe we'll take his heart and save somebody else's life, just like Ullah did.
Another Jew, a Jew who's the donor.
Just like Ullah did. Same thing. We're taking a donor, a Jewish donor, we're going to kill him, so to speak, a few minutes early, because he's halachically a treifa, in order to save someone who's a body, who's a healthy person, other than the fact that he has a bad heart. Yeah. So now, Rabbi Auerbach just finished telling us that you're not allowed to do that. So he has to now explain this Gemara, right?
So we really say that the guy was still living and he hastened this.
The Ran said that. That's what the Ran said.
Most people, he wouldn't do
It
that.
seems that was the case. It seems the case was that the guy was still somewhat alive, and Allah told him slaughter more so we can end him off quicker.
It was a trait for that. No,
That's the point.
right.
So are you again?
Therefore,
You
it's
want to
actually
prove it for
someone
this.
that's already deemed dead.
So,
Halacha dead.
So one second.
No,
So
no.
this is what we discussed last week at Lev. Killing a treifa still counts as killing. The question is, if you're allowed to, because you're not allowed to kill a treifa,
Someone who's condemned to death.
you're still not allowed to kill them.
Someone who's condemned to death and someone kills him, it's not chayav misa.
Oh, but still,
That's
we discussed this at Lev. That we discussed this. That was the huge discussion we had last week.
Exactly.
This is the discussion we had last week. That yes, indeed, he's not chayav misa, but it's still forbidden. It's still considered murder. The question is, are you allowed to do that murder in order to save someone else's life? Considering the Torah is lighter on it because it doesn't sentence you. And the raya is supposedly from Allah, who took a treifa and encouraged his quicker death to save his own life. So let's see now how Rabbi Auerbach addresses that. Considering that he just ruled that you may not be on the recipient of an Israeli heart, right? So he says, "Masha kasav raya, that which the questioner wrote to bring a proof. Ma'ad the Isa bin Adarim, that which the Gemara says in the Adarim, Daf Chav Beis or Aleph 22ba, which we looked at the Gemara last week. The shari la'oidid the bedibur, that it is permissible to verbally encourage the ligaran, and in this way cause Aidei came through the speech Lagdamas misas to hasten the death of someone else, ulatzalas atzmai, and in that way save himself. That was the story of Ullah. If that's the case, the same thing should apply, but in our circumstance. The recipient should be allowed to hasten the death of the donor because he's dying anyway. It should be permissible for the patient who requires a heart, a transplant, to sign up for such a transplant. Even though by doing so he's going to hasten the death of the donor because the donor is dying anyway. Just like Ullah hastened the death of that guy to save his own life. Ad kan dvarav. This is the end of the questioner's point. Says Rabbi Auerbach, im kidaita, if we're going to follow his reasoning, demar of sir, of you, dear sir. It's a formal way of writing about someone. If we're going to follow your view, that this case is compared to the case of Ullah, and and that would mean that perhaps it's permissible to allow for heart transplants, because the donor is anyways going to die. And the person receiving the heart is saving himself from death to life completely. The fact that he's asking the doctor to save his life by hastening the death of a patient who's anyways going to die. That's your logic to compare. Ulam, however, says Rabbi Auerbach, in my opinion, that story is not a proof at all. And I think he's going to make your point, Yassi. Ullah saved himself from a murderer that was standing there right in front of him. If you weren't to go and tell him, go finish him off more, then this murderer would have murdered him too. He is considered someone who had no choice in the matter. Wait. But over here, the whole thing is voluntary, meaning to say, the donor patient wasn't murdered by anyone. And there's no murderer that's threatening my murder unless I take that guy's heart. It's all voluntary. This person is volunteering to die early, and this doctor is volunteering to what's it called, to implement that early death, and the recipient is volunteering to be the one for the reason for that. This cannot be compared to the case of Ullah, there's a murderer standing here, murdering one person and about to murder a second. And therefore, this is more, sorry? Exactly. This is similar to that which the Rambam ruled, in chapter 5 of the laws of the foundations of Torah. This is the opening laws of Rambam, where he writes, the Halacha is, when Torah says, you should die rather than transgress, right? The three cardinal sins: murder, infidelity, forbidden relationships, adultery, and idolatry, and idolatry. Those are the three that you should rather die than transgress. So writes the Rambam. And nonetheless, if someone put a gun to a Jew's head and said, bow down to the idol or we shoot you, halacha is he's supposed to take the bullet. But if he didn't, potter, he is not liable. So ordinarily, a person who volunteers to bow down to an idol is liable for capital punishment. But in this case, because he had a gun to his head, he's not liable, even though he should have died. Right? Because he was forced to get compelled against his will. He didn't bow down to the idol by his own will. Okay, this is on the one hand. So on the one hand, he says someone who is compelled to do something against his will, even though he shouldn't have done it, is not liable for the punishment, right? Separating between the punishment and the obligation. Now, notwithstanding this, Pasak Sham, the Rambam rules there. A person who is sick and is almost going to die, and then gets healed by partaking of idol worship.
What does that mean?
Maybe some sort of medication that was forbidden because it was used for was an idol. He ate it, or whatever it is, or some ointment, whatever it is. Right. So now the question is, when it came to the case of the onos, the guy who had a gun to his head and unwillingly bowed down, we say exempt. Now the person who's almost going to die, and because he's almost going to die, does something to do with idol worship. What does he say? He is put to death. He is held accountable for that action because he did it willingly. So we see. Sorry, but these are the 1 second again. These are the three cardinal sins for which a person is supposed to die rather than transgress. So if he transgressed because he was compelled, even though he should have died, but he didn't. But because he was compelled, we're not holding him accountable. But in the case where he's going to die anyway, but he wasn't being compelled to death, and he volunteered to save himself, then he's held accountable and he's put to death after having survived thanks to idol worship. So what do we see? There's a major distinction between being compelled versus volunteering. So in the case of Ullah, he was compelled, it was a gun to his head. So whether or not Ullah should or shouldn't have done that, is a separate question. But you cannot use that as an example for the guy who's volunteering to die early, the doctor who's volunteering to be the one to kill him early, and me, the recipient, saying, I'm happy to be partake in this. Can compare to the case of Ullah, where he had a murderer standing over him who just finished murdering one guy and is about to murder the second.
Why can he also be like honest, the recipient? He's going to die. It's in the carrier of honor.
So that's why he quotes this Rambam, that even though the guy's about to die from sickness, he's still not allowed to take the Avodah Zarah. And if he did, he's chayiv misa. So we see that cholim, like the lamos, is not onus. A cholim is almost going to die. Doesn't count as onus. Onus is when there's an external force compelling you, not when nature says this is the way life is. Right, there's a distinction. And therefore, you cannot compare the case of the two volunteers, the recipient and donor, to the case of Ullah. It's a very brilliant chap. Okay. Oh, this is interesting. Halacha. Someone asked me about this recently. Same thing is true in Shulchan Aruch. Give citation, Orach Chaim, Siman Reish Dalet, Sivches. She'im ansul lecho. If a person was compelled to eat non-kosher, afilu nene mizeh, even if he ended up enjoying the non-kosher food, he does not make a bracha. Because he was compelled to do so, even though it happens to be he enjoyed it and it happens to be he's now full and doesn't need to eat supper. But because he was compelled, no bracha.
Even if he wasn't,
What was the case?
no bracha.
I'm just telling you what the short way here. I feel hachim nonetheless. But what happens if someone's sick and the only thing and the only way for him to eat is non-kosher food? Then chayiv levarach, he makes a bracha because he's doing so willingly. So we see again, compelled versus willingly, even though the willingness was because of a sickness, is not the same. So same thing here. We see two cases. In the case of Rambam, where someone who was compelled to partake of idol worship and save his life, even though he shouldn't have, exempt because it was compelled. Someone who's about to die and therefore takes idol worship is liable for capital punishment because he willingly took the idol worship, even though it was his death, his sickness that made him do it. Same thing here. If someone's compelled to eat not kosher, no bracha, because they're compelled. If someone is compelled by a sickness to take not kosher, then that eating is considered willing, and therefore, yes, make a bracha. Clear? Okay, beautiful words. Okay, we don't have a lot of time, and I did promise this was going to be the last class on the subject, so I don't want to harp for too long. So the last place we're missing is by Feinstein's position. By Feinstein's position is a little bit controversial. So I'll give you a little bit of the background, and you can look it up. It's on this page. It's on page 5, 6, 7, and 8. No, I haven't found. I told you that a friend of mine said that he found something from the Alter Rebbe. I not to ask him, but anyway. If it was clear from the Alter Rebbe, it would have been quoted in these articles I'm reading. So just look on page 5, and you'll see the first letter there. You can see that I included the date on the letter. It's important. It's Chav Dal Menachem Av Tavshin Lamed. That's the summer of 1971, page 5. So after the first two pictures, the pictures are cut up because I'm cutting out from pages. It's not here. Yeah, it's right here. The third picture. Chav Dal Menachem Av Tavshin Lamed. So it's the summer of 1971. Or is it 70? No, 71. But 70
It's not at the end of the year.
of the end of the year.
What?
Of the end of the year. It's the summer. So every 1971, right? No, 1970. 1970. So summer 1970. Yeah. So here, we're not going to read the whole thing, but he gets into a whole discussion and comes to the conclusion that the moment of death is the heart. The moment of death is the heart. And he goes on to talk about how even the Gemara, which we learned, the first Gemara we learned about trying to take the guy out of the rubble, and you check for his breath. Yeah, the whole business. He says you have to wait to see if there's breath. He says the reason why you're looking for breath is not because breath determines life or not. The heart determines life or not. But in ancient times, they had no way of knowing if the heart is pumping, other than checking out the breath. It's possible the heart is pumping so lightly that if you look for a pulse, you won't see it, but there's enough to keep the breath going, and therefore it's still alive. So he goes through a whole discussion to make the point that heart is the defining factor of death, and therefore he concludes. Remember, the date you see is 1970. He concludes and go to page. It's too bad I'm not going through all this because it's very beautiful. We'll go to page 7. The second paragraph there. The line begins with the word Shalai Gomer Dvara Bazeh. Then he writes.
7.
Yeah, page 7.
5th line, 6th line.
From the second paragraph, yeah. Is that Pashut Ubarer? It's clear and obvious to me, writes Rabbi Feinstein in 1970. Even if there's a ready and waiting heart from someone who's already dead. And we know he's dead somehow before we take his heart out. In which case, there's absolutely no murder from the person from whom we took Halev, the heart. Osir, it's forbidden. We do not rely on their assumptions. In 2 areas. We don't rely on him. We don't rely on the doctor saying that the current heart that the patient has is not viable. And we don't trust them that all of a sudden he's going to live longer from the heart he's getting. We see they're not such experts on the subject. We're talking about doctors. They're not such experts. They made mistakes in all of their activities, or many at least. And some of them purposefully make these mistakes. Because all these people who are recipients of heart transplants all died very quickly.
That's those days.
Yeah, this is 1970. And in the heart of the heart of the patient, the recipient, his original heart, and they admit that had we left the original heart in, he would have lasted longer. For all the doctors who do this, they're absolute murderers. It's seriously heavy. And in most of the times, many times when the heart is weak and the person's sick, he's not considered even a treifa yet. So talking about the donor. Meaning the whole discussion we had was, if the guy constitutes being a treifa, maybe we can kill a treifa early to save a. But this guy with a weak heart is not a treifa. They would have been liable for capital punishment if we were living in a time when we had courts for such. Very, very strong, as you can see.
Early against it.
This is 1970. Now, between 1970 and when he passed away in 1975, 1985 is 15 years. Science has advanced hugely. So if this was the end of it, the controversy wouldn't be that great, because at that time, the success rate of heart transplants was low. And as the success rate of heart transplants go higher, he's not going to be so against it, as we learned from the Nishmas Avraham, who said, right now it's in testing stages, so don't do it. But if one day we discover that we can have this mechanical heart replace you, then go ahead and do it. And Rabbi Feinstein wouldn't disagree with that. Why not? Because his whole problem is that there's a very low success rate. Yeah. The problem is, between this and 1985, when he passed away, he wrote another responsa about testing the moment of death. And there he talks about a dye that the doctors inject into the bloodstream to determine if there's brain activity. And he talks about that with respect to a different issue. And there he says, this is what he writes, don't declare him dead until you do that test. Oh, so which means this is the way people understood it. This is the way people always understood that. And I was looking for it, and I read in a few places that Rabbi Auerbach writes this, and I was looking for it, I couldn't find it. That Rabbi Feinstein, when he says, don't declare them dead until you inject this dye, is not to say that brain dead is the moment of death. But it's l'chuma, it's to be more stringent. That even if the heart stopped and the breath stopped, still don't declare him dead until you also do that. But that would have also been fine. But here comes the controversial part. In about a few months before he passed away, in Kislev Tashim Memhay, so look at page 8, you can see there. I put the source there, and there it says, Rosh Chodesh Kislev Tafshin Memhay. First day of Kislev, 1985, which is a few months, as I understand it, a few months before he passed away. He addresses it to Rabbi Yosef Brower with all the no, sorry, not Rabbi Yosef Brower, Rabbi Shin, I'm not sure that is. A rabbi doctor. Okay, he addresses it to this rabbi, and then he writes, after the Aleph, Hine, Nechti, my grandson, Rabbi Goin, Rabbi Mordechai Tendler Shtita, my grandson, Rabbi Mordechai Tendler, may live and be well, Dibur Iti Barichus, spoke to me at great length, about a lot of the doubts, and the investigations, that have these new findings, these new discoveries that you, my dear friend, have discovered, this doctor that is dressing. In New York, because of the decision of the leading authorities in New York, to accept that which they call misa samoyach, brain dead, kagdoras misa, as the actual definition of death. So my grandson told me all about what your findings with regard to this decision of New York, I guess the medical board, whatever it is, that decided that the defining moment of death is brain dead. Now, Lamaisa, in reality, says Rabbi Feinstein, Kafisha Shemaiti Mechasni, as I heard from my son-in-law, Rabbi Goin, Rabbi Moshe David Tendler, as I heard from my son-in-law, Moshe David Tendler, Rabbi Moshe David Tendler, Harachos Kibu Rakas Agdoras Hamaves, Shigam Tzedekas Ladina. They accepted this qualification of death, which is the correct qualification by Jewish law. Hagdara Shekodim Ha'Roifim, a classification that the doctors refer to as Harvard criteria. See, Harvard criteria. Harvard criteria, right? Which is it's conditions that determine the absolute ending of all brain function. It's called brain dead. For Harvard, which has been accepted by the Harvard standard, whatever Harvard criteria. Now, this, says Rabbi Feinstein, counts. This is considered as if the patient's head has been severed. Now, this is an important point, because the Gemara elsewhere says, like this is a mission actually, that if a person's decapitated, his body is still flailing, he still has heart function. This is a thing. But that person is still a tamei mes, still will cause tumah, still will cause impurity. Oh, so does that mean that if there's brain dead and heart function, he's still considered dead? In which case you could do a heart transplant. Okay, so there are those, and reasonably will argue that there's a very big difference between a severed head, in which there's no possibility, versus a brain dead. It's not exactly the same thing, right? But nonetheless, Rabbi Feinstein's ruling that brain dead equals decapitation. So right, brain dead function equals the severing of the head, complete decapitation. Tonight Harvard, when the Harvard conditions are met, the dead is the brain's completely stopped, God forbid. Now, even if the heart can continue to pump for a few days, less, so long as the patient does not have any independent capacity to breathe, he's counting as dead. And then he cites the tshuva. He cites the tshuva that I told you earlier, where Rabbi Feinstein writes not to declare someone dead until you do that test with the dye. So it's quite strong. In 1970 describes, sorry?
Your head's cut off, you're dead.
Okay.
Your heart's not pumping anymore.
But the person's flailing, right?
You can still see your own body.
No, I don't know what the psychology of that is, but I don't want to go there. But the point of the halacha of this, right? So you're right. Most, as we've learned, most people are of the opinion that they're not allowed to do a heart transplant, and they would agree with you, saying decapitation it's not the same thing as brain dead. But you see here, Rabbi Feinstein is saying yes, following the Harvard criteria of brain dead equals, halachically speaking, as a severed head, as a decapitation. That's the case. You could do a heart transplant. So this is a very, very controversial thing. What's the story with this tshuva? 1970, he writes emphatically, as we read, and it's too bad we didn't get to the whole thing. There's much more strong words with beautiful explanations to get to the Hampstead, which we quoted earlier, the story with chicken missing the heart. It gets into that. It gets into all these different cases and makes a very strong and beautiful argument that heart is the determining factor of death. And here, in 1985, just before he passes away, he writes brain. Okay, so it's a little controversial. And those that want to say that maybe this isn't really Rabbi Feinstein's view, but Rabbi Feinstein's son, David Feinstein, allegedly supports this latter tshuva and says this is his father's opinion. So we have in the minority. So we have then therefore three camps. In conclusion of this whole discussion, as a recipient, no problem. Even though we had the Chacham Tzvi, which said lacking a heart equals death, but we saw from Rabbi Eliashiv, we saw from Rabbi Auerbach, and we saw from Rabbi from the Mishnas Avraham, quoting Rabbi Auerbach, we saw from the Tzitz Eliezer that because the heart is going to continue to function and we see the person continues living, the fact that momentarily his heart was out doesn't constitute murder. Okay, so the recipient's end, no problem, take the heart, especially if it's a pig's heart. Why not? Or a mechanical heart, definitely. God willing, one day they'll be able to print hearts in machines and it'll be available for everybody who has a problem with the heart. I really hope one day that's going to happen. Why not, right? That's one issue. Issue number two is moment of death. If the moment of death is the heart, then of course you cannot do a transplant. Unless you're of the view that you're allowed to murder someone a few minutes early to save someone else. And there we have the divergent opinions. The majority of opinion following Rabbi Auerbach saying, absolutely not. Murder is murder is murder is murder. We don't care if you're killing him 5 minutes early, 10 minutes early, 10 years earlier. Murder is murder, you can't do it.
It's only regarding a Jew being the donor.
Yes, a Jew being the donor, yes. So that's issue number two. Number three was that, right? There's the recipient, there's the moment of death. And now, even if moment of death is by the heart, but because he's going to die a few minutes, maybe I'm allowed to. Two sides to the coin, majority saying, no, you may not murder, even though he's anyways going to die in 5 minutes from now. Rabbi Auerbach said, even though he's going to die at the same time, but you can't be the cause, even though by you not being the cause, you're letting someone else be the cause. You still can't be the cause of that death. That's how far Rabbi Auerbach went, right? Now, the fourth issue is, well, maybe there's a new way of thinking of moment of death. We have a minority opinion, but it's not just any minority. It's Rabbi Feinstein, so it's a very serious minority opinion, which says that brain death equals decapitation, and therefore you would be allowed to do a heart transplant. So again, this is really the minority opinion, and the majority opinion is one may not do so. And as Mr. Hackenborough always reminds me
They
this,
all do it.
to
They
make
all
my
do it.
disclaimer that if you're, all of this is for the purposes of Torah learning only, solely. When it comes to the question of what you should do if, God forbid, you're ever in such a situation, ask the local Orthodox rabbi. Do not rely on this video. Don't rely on this class. Talk to your local Orthodox rabbi and come with a ruling. But at least now we understand the gravity of the situation. We understand what it takes to be a leading halachic authority on this kind of level. We get an appreciation for what's being dealt with. Okay. Now, what do you want to say?
But they all do it. They do transplants. So there's no-
Don't Jewish donors? No. Orthodox Jewish donors?
not- okay,
Very,
not-
probably none today.
But I don't get.
Maybe,
this
maybe there are
case.
those who follow Rabbi David Feinstein who will say yes. I don't know that that's a popular,
So only from going.
yeah, or from pigs.
Alright.
Now from pigs you can
But
take.
anyways, this case with the decapitation, every single time that happens, the heart still beats. It's not a thing.
Look, I never watched the decapitation. I don't plan on doing that.
It's not a case. You can't bring from there. I don't get this case.
I don't
Your
know.
head's cut off, you're dead. Nothing to do to bring you to proving that the heart's still doing it.
That's the point.
It's a different ballgame.
Exactly. That's
It's
right.
not-
Because that's right. Because
One
the
thing is the same.
exactly right. Because
Okay.
decapitation equals death. Therefore, if you're of the opinion, like Rabbi Feinstein seems to be, that brain death equals decapitation, the guy's dead. If his brain is dead, he's
Brain
decapitated.
dead is not decapitation.
It's very sound logic. The logic is sound. I mean, look, we can see the arguments on
Brain
both
dead
sides.
is
It's not like
not
we can't.
decapitation.
It's a Rabbi Tendler, learning here in Montreal.
Yeah.
Typical,
He's a grandson.
Kollel. Yeah, good maybe great grandson. You'll find out he's
Aware of this.
familiar with this material, and if he has any insight.
Show him that, take a copy of that, show him.
So anyone that's brain dead, just kill them all, because if it's decapitation, he's dead. All these guys, what are you keeping him alive for? A lot of guys are brain dead, whatever the story.
I'm
is.
sure many doctors,
Kill them all.
I'm sure many doctors would agree with you, for better or for worse. But we're gonna see,
I don't see how
we
you-
didn't get to see it, but there are other
bring that
cases,
case.
like Rabbi Waldenberg writes about. We've seen many cases of patients who were brain dead for years and then
And
woke
came
up
back.
later. So like, who, you decided that they're dead now, what are you
So
doing?
That's what I was
We've
just gonna
seen,
say.
it's unfortunate not to go through Rabbi Waldenberg's language. He's very strong and says, I can't believe this is happening in Israel. We have to tear open the heavens and stop this. We've seen patients after patients who have been brain dead for years and then come back, and that you decided they're dead and taking their hearts out. This is murder. I mean, he's really, really strong, Rabbi Waldenberg, against it. And the majority of Rabbi Shevet Halevi, Rabbi Wosner, and Rabbi Auerbach, as we saw, Nishmas Avram, the majority of major halachic authorities are against. Rabbi Feinstein is in that minority camp.
I don't see how you say brain dead is decapitation.
Not for me to weigh in, just relaying the message. Okay, so for next week, we have, we could do the question.
Abortion?
So we've been on medical ethics for quite a long time already. And if we like this, we can continue. We can go down to the question of abortion. Another topic that came up, that someone sent me a list of chuvas on a very interesting question, is, are you allowed to daven for someone else to do teshuva?
Are you allowed to?
Yeah,
What's more?
is it makes, we're going to learn about this,
More.
We'll learn about this. about whether it's appropriate to ask of Hashem, to daven to Hashem that someone else should do teshuva.
That someone should do children.
Yeah. That's a
Like
topic
you
might find interesting.
Get well,
Why is it?
why what's wrong? What's wrong?
I'm just telling you this, I haven't learned it
What's the
yet, but there's
Shaalos
chuvas like this.
We'll
So
find
maybe
out.
we could do that. But if you have, if you have inspiring to the chuvas, one thing, but we'll learn. I don't know. I haven't looked it up yet. I'm just telling you,
Yeah.
I'm,
Can't
I'm
be-
always looking out for
can't
these
be
things.
doing
So I saw this come up.
You're praying to Hashem to give him the source of the able to do.
I don't know either. We'll find out.
No,
But
these
if there's
days,
other, I'm just opening up the
what
floor.
would be no? Why would be no?
I don't know yet. I don't know yet. I don't know yet.
You care about.
Okay, you know what's maybe it's interesting.
That'll
That'll be the subject next week.
Everything wants to push the bottom.
So we have,
I
so
don't-
good. So we have the subject for next week with Hashem.
I want to know why. Why would you think?
I don't know
not?
yet. I don't know. I don't know yet. We'll learn, we'll find out. But just in general, so abortion was another one. But just in general, it was biking on Shabbos. We had once as an idea, biking on Shabbos. But just in general, if there are such questions that you want to delve into, let me know. I'm happy to do the research and we'll find stuff and we'll put something together. Okay, but not good.